Welcome to At the Table with AACC, the Asian American Christian Collaborative. At the Table is a series of roundtable discussions where Asian American Christian pastors and leaders are able to draw from their experiences, education, and expertise to discuss questions and issues that impact the Asian American Christian community and the church. We're here today at the historic Chinese Community Church of Washington, D.C., located in the heart of Chinatown. The church was founded in 1935 and is the only Chinese church in D.C. proper. My name is Joshua Cho, and I am Korean American, but I am the English pastor of the Chinese Community Church here in D.C. And I'm joined here by some wonderful folks that have a lot of things to share, wisdom, nuggets, experience. And so we're just going to go around and introduce ourselves briefly.
Yeah, my name is Kevin Yee, and I'm the college and young adults pastor at Church Every Day in Northridge, California.
I'm Dorothy Lau, and I'm the youth director at the Chinese Bible Church of Maryland in Rockville, Maryland.
My name is Hugo Cheng. I'm the senior pastor of the Chinese Bible Church, Maryland. I have the privilege of serving with Dorothy.
All right, so today we're going to talk about volunteerism and professional ministry and balancing those two things within the church, and also navigating that balance between volunteer efforts and professional roles in ministry. So we're just going to start with the first question because many people who are listening may not really know these terms. So how would you define the terms volunteerism and professional Christian ministry? How would you put it in your own words in the context of church and ministry roles?
Want to take this one? Ladies first.
Oh, sure, yeah. When I think of volunteerism, I think mostly about being a layperson, and this person may or may not have a full-time marketplace job, but they serve actively in their local church to which they're committed, versus professional ministry being someone who has committed themselves to working full-time in whether it be a church or other ministry organization as a pastor, other specialty minister, equivalent.
Yeah, I think one way to define it is whether or not you get paid to do things at church. Because the expectations are slightly different, you know.
Although sometimes you don't get paid and the expectations are still full-time, you're ministry, right? Yes.
It's true.
You get paid in pork buns.
Yeah, I'll take it. So what are some of the motivations that lead people, you think, to engage in volunteer work, serving in the church, within the context of church? And how might these motivations differ from those who pursue professional roles in ministry? So those who volunteer and serve in the church versus those, I guess, as you said, are paid to be in ministry in the church. What are some motivations?
Biblically speaking, or reality?
However,
I mean, it should be reality.
Yeah,
okay.
biblically should be reality.
Yes, I know. The reason I say that is that sometimes, I think people do that because they get a sense of accomplishment, or they get people's affirmation. And I can't discount that, and it's not completely not important. But I think biblically speaking, at least when we try to teach and disciple our people, is that you've been called, the gospel saved you, the gospel gifted you, and you're part of the body of Christ. So whether you're professional, quote unquote, or volunteer, or lay volunteer, you should be serving. Maybe "should" is kind of a strong word, but it's actually good for them. It's part of their new spiritual life to serve, right?
Yeah, I agree. And I know when I first actually read the topic, the word volunteer is one that generally, I don't really ever use. I mean, sometimes, but I also like the word serving, right? Opportunities to serve, because like you said, for us in the church, we're teaching that Jesus is the one that we live for, and he's the one that we serve because he first served us. And in that sense, it's not just like, oh, I could do that, I'll volunteer my time, but it's, I'm serving one and serving the church because of my relationship with God. And so that's a call whether you get paid or not, but God gives us different callings, right? Some are called to be full-time pastors, some are called to be coordinators, whatever it might be within the church, but everyone, right, is called to serve.
Yeah, in fact, I would contend that that's an issue we as leaders have to really disciple and teach and preach our people, because I think I'm not saying volunteerism is a bad word, and I'm not questioning the title of this talk, right? But we, some of the elders and pastors, and we had a discussion a couple of weeks ago just about that we don't use the word volunteerism because sometimes in a secular world, that seemed to be sort of, I decide I want to volunteer. It's for my own good, out of the goodness of my heart, right? And in fact, some of the first-gen elders are saying, oh, we always call them co-workers, whether they're, and then we're called, like you said, to serve. And I think we should be teaching our people that it is a privilege, it is an honor, it is a responsibility to serve. It's not whether you want to volunteer or not, in a secular sense.
Yeah, I also think that it is a discipleship issue, and it's so, to me, it's tied in with Christian maturity. I think maturity seeks out where needs are and seeks to fulfill those needs in the church body. So I always try to, because our churches, we're always constantly asking for volunteers. I feel like it's always a need. There's always some place to serve. And so when I'm, as a pastor, when I'm making the announcement about why you should serve, I'm always talking about the idea of this is how you grow, right? Learning how to serve somebody that can't give anything back to you is an area where you can grow so much because you need Jesus in order to fulfill that role. And if you're, are looking for something in your life to help you to grow in Christ, what better way to grow in Christ than consistently being in need? Now, there's a balance for sure, but I try to present it that way to help people understand that this is how we grow in Jesus.
And you know what the interesting thing is, I think, if I could add, as pastors, we get paid to be in ministry and it's a professional role, but there hasn't been once in my years of ministry, where I thought to myself, hey, they're paying me, so I need to do this. With an honest, clear conscience, I have never thought that.
Man, you're a good man.
I do. No,
you're
really,
a holy man.
No, I do it because God has given me this unbelievable calling, and there are people who are willing to support me in this call to full-time ministry. And so when I think about it like that, I don't even like to use the word professional role, because again, it's everyone in the body is called to serve, but just unique context and call in how we're called to serve in that way. So I hope, although I know that there are some who enter ministry thinking about, first thing they ask even when they go to church is, what's the package look like, right? What's the compensation? And it's true. And I hope that we are teaching our congregations and the young people what it means to serve without expecting in return, because we've been served by Christ, right?
Although it's kind of interesting, there's sort of a tension, at least for Chinese churches or Asian American churches. There's the first gen, the CM side, I'm sure the Chinese side, and then the EM side. And I find, at least in our church, maybe Dorothy will agree, hopefully not disagree, but we'll see. On the Chinese side, we found that there's much easier to get volunteer. They're very committed. They want to serve. But then their danger is that they sometimes put serving or other people should serve. It's coming from not so much the Christian heart of want to follow Jesus. I'm sure that's there, but it's a lot of the Chinese first gen. They work hard. You work hard at everything. You should be committed and labor hard. And then sometimes also when there's an added layer of kind of subtle legalism, so that's the danger, even though the good thing is that they want to serve, but then the bad thing is that there may be legalism and cultural baggage. But then on the English side, the younger generation, sometimes more consumerism, and so they think, I'll volunteer or not, I'm busy, I feel like it or I don't feel like it. So I feel like I'm constantly trying to get this side, get closer towards the gospel, still wanting to serve, but serve for the right reason, not be legalistic or have the guilt and shame culture, right? But then on this side, trying to get them closer to the gospel too, because they're not thinking about, like you were saying, discipleship and Christian maturity, so that's kind of the tension in our church. So.
I think it's just a very classic demonstration of, although this is somewhat generalized, is that the first generation did well to constantly serve their children, but they didn't necessarily disciple their children. And so now these children are more grown or into adulthood, and all of these young adults or older young adults, they know how to be served, but they don't want to serve because that wasn't really passed down to them. They've observed it, but they also may have seen the gripes or the bitterness that have come from their parents having served, but not out of necessarily a desire or like a genuine wanting to serve because of the transformation of the gospel and how that permeates into the family, versus like, yeah, it sounds too hard, so I'm just gonna not do that. Or, oh, I have to work with older people. That doesn't really sound like my cup of tea.
There's always a reason.
Yeah, it's like we can't do boba because they're pre-diabetic or they're diabetics. Like, well, that's unfortunate, so I'll just stick to my demographic silo. So, I mean, I say that humorously, but at the same time, like, those are the conditions which have been brought about from the families that have developed over the last 3 or 4 decades.
Well, even also within the church as
yeah,
well, right?
And we've allowed that to happen.
Yeah, so I think as church leaders, it's a challenge, because anytime when we started bringing up, like you were saying, the discipleship process of wanting them to serve so they can grow, but as soon as they think that it smells like what the other people, the more legalistic people, or what their parents had trying to force them to do in the past, they try to tune us out. But we're really trying to help them to get understanding that it's the gospel, is the following of Jesus. It's not the old way of trying to force you or guilt you into serving.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, or were you going to say something?
Well, I was going to say that, like, so in the immigrant church, and I know this goes for a lot of second and third generation Asian American churches too, but we categorize everyone into these age categories. And it's this idea that, like, we are one church, but there's children's church, there's youth group, there's college students are on their own, there's, you know.
And that's just English.
Yeah. But the idea is, when you add that on top of the language and cultural barriers, you do get this sense of, like, I'm most comfortable with my people. And so later on, when people are asked to serve, it becomes, so, like, for example, in our church, like, all the adults, they do speak English to some degree because you live in America, you work in America, you have enough English skills to be able to survive. But all of a sudden we're like, well, you should volunteer to be a youth teacher, or you should volunteer to be a, you know, elementary small group leader. And it's like, all of a sudden they can't speak English anymore. And it's like, why that it becomes an excuse for not wanting to do the cross-generational. Yeah. And so I'm always trying to help people to understand that the cross-generational is how faith thrives in our churches. Without that cross-generational engagement, really what you end up with is people who grow up in church, in an immigrant church, for example, and then will leave and go somewhere else. But then the immigrant adults are like, why are the kids leaving? And part of it is because we're not doing the cross-cultural discipleship. And that's one of the ways that, you know, immigrant churches, like, the whole feeling is we're supposed to be this family. But if we're a family that really doesn't know how to communicate with each other or makes excuses for the language, then it should be no surprise that the next generation is looking for another family. You know?
Yeah, or you get a typical complaint, right? That the EM, English ministry, often say, how come we're the ones who always take care of all your kids, right? How come we're the Chinese speaking? Now, thankfully, at our church, if you look across the board, there's actually a good number of Mandarin speaking that are teaching the children, volunteering for that. So.
Yeah, I think one thing, you know, I do want to say is, just so it doesn't sound like we're just kind of negatively seeing the first gen or the immigrant church, there's a lot of things they too have culturally that maybe they don't have round tables for, where they can talk on why do we do things the way that we do at times, but really trusting that in God working in their lives, in their heart, in their generation as well, that they're doing the best they can, right? But I do think it always goes back to the motive, right? Mark 10:45 tells us, for even the Son of Man, right? He should have come to be served, but he came to serve instead. And so what I've noticed at times is there are people who become very good at volunteering. Like you said, for recognition or moving up in terms of being recognized, even status within the church. And so as people, we can't really control people's motivations, but some people become so good at doing church. Right? They're there for everything. They show up to everything. They're affirmed for that. And so they feel, okay, you know, I'm someone important in the church, but have to go back to the motivation. Are you here to serve God because he served you? Or are you here to serve yourself through the means of church, through the means of serving? And so I think motivation is paramount. And how do we do that? How do we teach that? It's through preaching, but it's through living it out as well. Modeling again, right, for people. How do we serve in a way that honors and glorifies God? And that's not kind of shrouded in false humility or false modesty, right?
There have to be really good accountability structures in place also. Like, I've been in circumstances where there's particularly in youth ministry, there's like the people that love being around youth ministry,
Yeah.
but then when it comes to like their own service or their own worship, they're just like not there for things that really should be for themselves. So those are always kind of like concerning circumstances, but I think we have to have really good accountability structures in place to be able to ask those questions of like what's really motivating you.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because there's youth that you'll see even become like youth leaders within the youth group, and even become like for youth groups that have presidents of the youth group and things, and then they go to college and it's like they're not going to church. They've fallen off, you know, they're not on that grid anymore. And it's like, well, how did that happen? They were so faithful. They were serving in every aspect, but they weren't growing in their heart. Their motivation wasn't being changed, crafted, molded by God. And I think that's something, again, we can't control. We pray for, we try our best to, you know, impress upon them that this is why we do it, right? But yeah, that's something that I've definitely noticed within people who serve, volunteer, and even for pastors. Let's not make it into a professional role, right? Where it's like, well, this is just my career. No, it's like, it's our call, right? Yeah.
I do want to differentiate, though, that there is a distinction between being faithful and being consistent. And both are very positive terms, I would say, but being consistent, like you're regular, maybe you're mostly on time, you're able to show up, right? But then faithful is like, it's taking consistency a step further because the motivation is rooted in the desire to serve out of how Christ has already served us. Whereas consistency, like a lot of our students could be consistent because their parents make sure and micromanage that they are on time, that they're taking care of their responsibilities. And so if that was never really the student's desire, then it makes sense why certain progression of or regression of things happen when they go to college.
Yeah.
And without accountability or checking in, it's like they're not regularly reminded of what they believe or who they know cares about them.
Sure.
So
I really appreciate the kind of the vein of this whole conversation, because I think, again, going back to what you're saying, is the motive. Because this conversation could be very pragmatic, right? It's like, what are all the method, tricks and stuff, or things we can say to get more volunteer? And sometimes you can get volunteers to do the things you need to do because time, you know, there's urgency, you need people, you need help, and then we sacrifice the harder, the thing that takes longer to teach about motivation and discipleship and accountability to just get people to help. But I think in the long run, if we do what you were saying, you know, teaching about how Jesus served and why we should serve it, and the right motive, I think we will get volunteers or get enough coworkers and people to serve in the long run, and with a better foundation of motive.
Yeah.
I have a question. So and I don't know if this is true of Chinese immigrant churches, but in Korean immigrant churches, I really feel like when it comes to getting volunteers for things that require labor, it's relatively easy. Like setting up chairs, cooking meals.
using your body.
Yeah, like giving rides, using your body. That stuff's really easy to ask for, and people definitely are like, oh, I'll definitely be there for those things. But when it comes to like discipleship and things that are more about spiritual things, it's harder. And part of that is people feel inadequate to do that work, you know? And that's what I feel like I always struggle with when it comes to thinking about how do we get more volunteers to recognize, how do we get more volunteers to recognize that the spiritual work, the discipleship work, that again is where the Spirit does the most work in you. And none of us are fully equipped for everything that we're gonna do. Otherwise, every single person will be a professional. Like, we're calling on volunteers specifically so that this is like work you can be invited into. How do you discover your calling, or how do you know that you're called to something unless you've tried something, right? Yeah. So that's always the ways that I'm talking about. But I don't know if it's true necessarily in the Chinese church that you guys are seeing.
I'd say it's pretty true, actually. Because, so I joke sometimes that because this is the DC metropolitan, right? Like, we have so many educated, highly qualified, if not overqualified persons, and our church is saturated with them too, like government workers, agency workers, contractors, etc. And what's kind of sardonic is that similarly, it's not that they're resistant to stepping into spiritual responsibilities or spaces or roles that they will be more nurturing, but in a way, because that requires more thinking, more preparation, more reflection and meditation on the word, it's like, oh, there's a lot that goes into it, and I don't want to mess it up because a lot of type A people, right, perfectionism in it, that's kind of woven in. But on the other hand, I do notice that it's just a frame of mind. It's like, I want to do something simple really well rather than to do something hard poorly or mediocrely. So it's like, if I'm gonna drive a kid, I'm gonna follow the speed limit, sign that waiver. Hopefully that's not necessary. But if I'm gonna have to disciple someone, it's like, actually, can we do a tutorial, or maybe that's a little demeaning, but like, can you walk me through this and do a step-by-step so that once I've gone through it, then I can do that with the student. So I think that's just been one of, ironically, one of the more practical things is, you said invitation. We're inviting people to take part in the mission of God and, contextualize in our church. And I do believe that even though it takes more time, it's important to develop and walk alongside people if they at least have the interest. And they might not be a professional minister, which, Pastor Hugo has often said, like, none of us really should be professionals. It's just going off of our different calling. But walking with them and developing them, and that's really a model and integration of discipleship and mentorship.
Can I say one word that comes to mind is empowerment?
Yes. Yes.
Because I think too often, sadly, sometimes in the church, leaders want to show that they're leaders, like Christian leaders, like pastors. And so sometimes what happens is a system is set up where with the spiritual things, you look to me because I'm the spiritual leader. But what we have to do is empower and say, no, all of us have a responsibility and a very meaningful way to impact the next generation. Yeah. And so empowerment, it goes to like what you're speaking on, where, some of the most, blessing and fruitful things that I've seen is when I was in youth ministry is bringing the parents in and just talking with them about how they can communicate with their children well, so that they know that they're loved, so that they know they're cared for. And then also speaking with the youth on how you can show grace to your parents, and really kind of empowering both to see that they can impact one another, serve one another, bless one another. And I'll kid you not, there were tears, like parents hugging their kids. It's just, God was really working in this. And I think they felt empowered. I can speak to my kids. I might not have perfect English. I might not be able to know everything they're going through in their context, but I can try. Yeah. And that's an important part of my calling. And so I think empowering others to see that they have a meaningful purpose to reach into relationships is a very important thing that we need to be doing as leaders. Yeah.
I guess as pastors, preacher, we kind of give 2-point, 3-point sermons, right? Because as you talk, I think about, there's the motivation, as you talked about it, and then there's the invitation, as you talked about it, and then maybe another shin is the preparation, right? Because we need to train them. And I think in our church, I think it has helped. We try to really pound Ephesians 4, 11 to 16, right, in their heart, or help them to really be inspired by that, because we as the quote unquote staff or professionals, our main job is to really coach them, right? To help them, to equip them so that they do the work of service. And one analogy I give, sorry for sports analogies, but NFL's coming out, right? But imagine you turn on the TV, right? And then you see on the field Bears coach and Ravens coach playing football against each other. It may be amusing for 10 seconds, 15 seconds, but you say, let the coach get off the field and let the player play, right? And I think sometimes people coming to church, they think that they're the audience. They're drinking Coke, eating popcorn and peanuts, where they should really be exercising and be on the field, right? And our job is to really coach them to be players, and I think Ephesians 4, 11, 16 really solidified that, and we try to inspire people with that in motivation, but then we also have to train them, equip them, or else they don't know what to do. And then after that, I think to continue to support them, to encourage them, the accountability, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and we need to be coached. Right? Yeah. We need to keep on growing and being in the Word and have accountability with other pastors, right? To continue to be challenged, to love on our congregations, with the love of Christ. And so, I think one question kind of that moves into then, talking about communication, right? How can communication and mutual respect, right? Because there are different roles, right? Professional roles or volunteers. Like, how can open communication and mutual respect between those two groups be cultivated, right? So that it's always feels like a collaboration and not like, oh, well, you're the pastors or you're the, you know, professional workers and we're the volunteer workers. Like, what can we do to help cultivate a positive and collaborative experience in those times?
I mean, I don't have any magic formula, but I think it's always being proactive to either formally or informally get people together or get together with people, and also getting people together. Right? So for myself, you know, I partly also because I was new about 7 years ago coming to the church, I wanted to get to know people, so I invite them out for coffee or just, you know, sometimes invite them to my office scares them because going to the senior pastor's office, you know.
Am I in trouble?
Yeah, am I in trouble? Yeah, sometimes they ask, you know.
Close the door.
Yeah, but just being proactive in meeting other people, and then sometimes it's interesting. They're like, you know, they may not think they're in trouble. They're like, okay, why are we meeting? What project you want to talk about? I say, no agenda. Just want to get to know you. And they're like, why? You know, and I think, but then fostering that culture also. Yeah. So it's not just me trying to get to know people, but then they realize, oh, actually, I can do that. I can just get together with people just to know each other. And then, of course, sometimes we do talk about ministry, but then getting the deacons, the elders, the pastoral staff together. Because I think sometimes it's unintentional, but we're kind of in silos. All the deacons are doing the deacons' work. All the elders are doing the elder stuff, and pastors doing pastor stuff, forgetting that we really need to talk to each other. And but being intentional and proactive in and maybe tenacious in fostering that. So.
All right. Any experiences you can think of where there was this kind of good collaboration that you saw between, you know, those who were serving and volunteering and those who were serving through their call to professional ministry? Or
one of the things I'm thinking about, as we're even just talking about the previous question with communication, is I think that there's definitely layers to how we ask people to serve. And I think one of the things that's pretty powerful in the immigrant church is the ministry of presence. So when young people show up to things that they're not necessarily is like for them, or when older people show up for things that are not necessarily for them, I think there's definitely a feeling of solidarity. So I know, like, when we do joint worships and we have to do things in Korean and English, it's a drag on everyone with the translation and different things. And Asian American churches those are things that are unique to our calendars. But there's always a sense of going in is like, oh, how long is this going to be? How hard is this going to be? But coming out, everyone's always like, this was nice. I always feel that. And it doesn't matter how many times we do it, whether it's every 2 months or once a year, but it always feels that way. And I think it's because we forget often just how good it is for us to be in the same spaces with one another, even if we weren't even necessarily serving each other. And so I think that's like a first step. And I think communicating that and talking about that often actually is something where we're respecting one another and saying, I want you there. You don't have to serve, but you being there is a blessing to me because this is it's such a warm, and again, it's how we build in that feeling of family.
Your church, you are way more holy than we are. I think, you know, because just again, to be honest, I you know, plenty of the churches serve in the Chinese church circle, and maybe Dorothy have different experience, but most experience I have is that both sides, especially the younger side, the English-speaking side, they just really dislike, maybe hate is a strong word, dislike, and no matter what you say, even afterwards, they don't leave, like you said, your church have that feeling. They afterwards like, oh, I should have gone to another church, you know, on this Sunday, you know. But we did find, in our case, serving together actually brings the generation together. Because we try, you know, combine worship services, potlucks and so on, and we found that just those things doesn't seem to really inspire them. But then when they do serve together, like I just came back from a short-term mission, and on the short-term mission trip in our church, we have senior citizens all the way to teens. And when they were serving together in Brooklyn, New York, they really gelled, you know, and so having sort of a purpose of serving together, that really helped them, you know. But I thought maybe Dorothy, I know one of the biggest undertaking in some ways for our church that require a lot of volunteers or a lot of co-workers is the the youth winter retreat and the summer camp, right? But it seems like other than you who are the full-time staff, there's tons of counselors or volunteers and so on. So maybe you can share a little bit about like how that come together,
I mean, if I put it lightheartedly, I do know arm twisting. I make invitations, and I actually, now this is me being serious. When I make those invitations, I tell potential volunteers, this is an opportunity to serve. This is one way to grow and explore potential ways that God has gifted you, or even just to exercise some of what you've learned as a youth, now serving youth. So working with college students, working with some young professionals, postgrads, et cetera. But what I also advocate is that this isn't just about the students. I mean, yes, it is, for the students, but this is just as much for the volunteer to be unified with the team, to grow in vulnerability and accountability, because they're going to be sharing about mutual experiences and frustrations of ministering to the students. And so what I tell them is, this is going to be some work, but it's good work for the kingdom. But more than that, you grow with the people with whom you serve. And to me, I think that is really a picture of the church, is you are pouring into others, you're walking alongside others, and then those who are overseeing are pouring into our volunteers. So to me, I think that, I don't know if I could call it a success story, but maybe it's a healthier model of how volunteering and full-time ministers work together to co-labor for the kingdom. So I think just being at CBCM and also seeing it in my previous church context in Chicago, it's that when our students, when our volunteers have really witnessed God working, that is the motivation in and of itself. It's like, there's fruit here, so I don't want to just leave the field. I want to come back to it and cultivate and see the harvest as it is ripe. And that's why, even though things could be hard, we know it's worth it.
I actually have a question. I don't know if you have a particular direction, but this I'm always curious about. In our church, we often had discussion and even disagreement about is in terms of showing appreciation, especially for the volunteers. And that also in our church shows the generation gap. The older generation says, what appreciation? You don't need appreciation. You do for God, and if you honor God, that's good. And then the younger or the English congregation usually will be saying, well, we need to appreciate our volunteers. We should have some ways to show appreciation, like or even a meal, and then and so on. But then the older generation would chime back and says, well, if you want to take them out for a meal, do it on your own dime. The church money should not be paying for food. So there's a tension there. But what do you think about, or how do you practice in your church showing appreciation to your volunteers or those who serve?
At our church, we try not to have that argument by just saying this is how our church does stuff. Okay. And so we do, generally speaking, after larger events where we have a lot of volunteers. For example, I think the biggest event of our church is the VBS. So that's the one that really brings together all the generations. And so we always have a banquet afterwards for all our volunteers. And we generally try to make that not just a meal, but really just celebrating the work that God's done. And then we have a culture of doing what we call reunions. And those are basically anytime there's a mission trip or anytime there's a retreat or something where we're requiring a lot of volunteers, we do reunions after. But those are essentially like volunteer appreciation meals. But again, the whole point of it is not to have the meal, but it really is to recap and remember the work that God's done through everyone. So we consider those more like celebrations. So I think that's one of the ways that we've got rid of that tension, but definitely, every year there's like, how many of these do we have to do? Does it have to be, there's always people that, does it have to be after every single one? And definitely, I don't know. In our church, I don't think that's necessarily a generational conversation, so much as it is a time conversation. Like, wait, they just gave all this time and now they have to give an extra evening or an extra afternoon to come to this thing. So it generally is like, are we better serving them by not asking them to come to another thing, yet another thing? But it's always like, but that's, optional. So there's not a lot of pressure to come to that.
I think, there's always some tension, right? And the tension is this: if we were to give appreciation via a meal, gift card, whatever it might be, then are we then creating a system where their hearts are inclined to do it, but they're doing so with that reward or that appreciation in return, right? And I think that's sometimes what we have to surrender up to God. I think a lot of times we think, if I do this, then all their hearts are going to look like this, or then they're going to be motivated by this. And sometimes it's fear, sometimes it's worry, right? And the reality is, guess what? God is so much bigger than that decision. Where if there's people that are going to serve, even forced to be served, guess what? Forced to be there on Sunday with the youth group, God can still do an awesome work in their hearts and bless them and grow them. So but I think it's a very important question, because it's always a matter of what are we teaching to the congregation, right? Because it's not just like, do we want to spend money or not? At least I don't think it should be that at the bottom line, but what are we teaching by making this action to the congregation? Are we fostering a heart that wants to serve because of what Christ has done? And I think we can't really control that, but I think that's why it's awesome. Obviously in your church, you want to do that. That's why the question is there. And so, for us, we just encourage people to serve at our church. And if someone does an incredible amount of work, like, we want to show appreciation in some ways. But there's no, like, every time someone serves in this capacity, you get this, or so I think the question is good, because it really shows a heart of wanting to make sure that we're teaching and fostering that type of heart that wants to serve because Christ has served us. So with that being said, I think we're maybe gonna just wrap it up. But maybe if there's just one quick sentence that you want to say, one or two sentences to wrap up before we close our discussion. It's been awesome, and we can definitely keep talking for many, many days, I'm sure, with the different things that we have on our plates and on this topic. But if there's one or two sentences that you could say.
Just shoot off the top of my head. Sure. I really appreciate learning from what you guys are sharing, and I think like you were saying earlier, it's not all negative. In fact, there's a lot of positive, right? So I really appreciate, because I've been to non-Asian American churches, right? So-called white churches and so on, right? And I think sometimes the larger churches are going the route of being very professional, right? Everything you hire staff, down some bigger churches, they even hire someone just to click the slides, for you, or open the doors and so on, right? So I think I appreciate about Asian American churches that, because it's a lot of times still kind of homegrown, even as it gets bigger, right? I think there's more sense of, this is my home, my house, and I want to serve, and I really pray that we can preserve that, but then of course, buttress that with the biblical motivation and foundation. But I think Asian American churches overall, there is a stronger sense, in my experience, of people being willing to serve than let's just hire people for professionals. Yeah. So.
I would say that having a good balance, depending on the context, of lay volunteers and professional or full-time ministers, there may be barriers, but the blessings are greater. And secondly, that because of this balance and blend, it teaches all of us to be more gracious and patient with each other.
Yeah. Going back to what you were saying about balance, I think keeping a very healthy tension is one of the ways that we hold ourselves accountable to making sure that we're not running too far in the professionalism versus putting everything on volunteers. I think having that tension and thinking through it and having that conversation and praying through it is one of the ways I think that we prevent ourselves from going overboard in any one way or another. And so I think that's, like, healthy tension is a good thing. I always think about it in terms of music, like a guitar string only makes beautiful music when there's tension on both ends. And so I think for us to constantly be having this conversation, I would like to encourage people, like, don't be exhausted by that. Recognize that that's something that the Holy Spirit uses to keep our churches in line. But also, I think, again, inviting people into that conversation is just another way to help our congregants to grow and to mature in Jesus and to rely on the Holy Spirit to help us navigate through those questions. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would just say, Yeah, serve because we have been served by Christ. We need the whole body of Christ, and that's people who are volunteering and serving, those who are called to be pastors and full-time that need support of the church. And yeah, remember that God is in control of all these things, but communicate. I think that's one thing that was big is if you're volunteers, and oftentimes we have volunteers who serve more, right, more often, are involved in most things. When they have, even if it's a complaint, hear them out.
Yeah.
See what way you can care for them more. And then also for those who are volunteering, to give grace to the leaders, because we're definitely not perfect in how we go about everything too. So with that being said, our At the Table talk has come to an end. Thanks for being at the table with us.